Today we're launching a new series called Second Sip, which is a deeper dive into issues. The first issue that we're going to begin to explore is feminism, and specifically feminism post-Beyonce and post the Beyonce flap. Over the last year, the topic of whether Beyonce is or is not a feminist has been in the news, in part generated by herself and the way in which others have responded to her. But very rarely has there actually been a definition of what feminism is. And so we're going to talk to a variety of different people of how they specifically define feminism and what it means in and of their lives. Today we're going to begin by talking to Miriam Ticktin, who was the director of gender studies at the New School last year and is one of the reasons why Bell Hooks ended up there as scholar in residence. Miriam is an anthropology professor there and teaches a class on feminist theory. She's now moved on to co-direct another institute still at the New School, but we're happy to have her today to talk about feminism.
Thank you so much for having me. I love that you've chosen this topic.
Thank you, as you would. On caffeine, we always begin with a number. And so I wanted to begin with 1963, because that was the year of the feminine mystique by Betty Friedan, who many people believe initiated in part with this book, this at that time groundbreaking radical book on feminism, the modern feminist movement. And so can you talk a little bit about who she is and why that was so important and what it did?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Betty Friedan was, I guess, one of the early members of what one would call second wave feminism. Right? Just to be clear, I guess the idea of waves and feminist waves is an American one. Right? There's lots of different feminist movements around the world, but the way the American trajectory has gone has been described in waves. So first wave would have been suffragettes, would have been the women who were fighting for the vote and for equal rights in the political sphere. With Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique was the idea that it's not just about voting rights or about equal rights again in the political sphere in front of the state, but it's the personal is political. You know, this is the first moment where we said, oh, actually, you know, it's not public and private, where the private is not political. In fact, the private is incredibly political. And the reason women are stuck at home and are housewives is because of a larger patriarchal system that naturalizes women's role as housewives. She named a thing that said, she called something that cannot be named, and it was a description of the happy housewife. And all these women were supposedly stuck at home with their children and were miserable. Were just incredibly miserable. And if you've seen Mad Men, Betty in Mad Men is based on Betty Friedan. That's why we've called her that. And she's incredibly, you know, she's miserable. And she can't exactly say why, right?
Oh wow.
Yeah. So, so it kicked off this movement that went into kind of all spheres of life, right? To try to reformulate, challenge gender roles.
So it moved from this idea of women battling to get out of the home into a much larger conversation.
Precisely, exactly. So battling to get out of the home. And I guess the incredibly important thing to note, and which was noted later, of course, by other feminists, is that this was a white middle-class movement. It was women who were middle-class and had their husbands working and brought in enough money for them to stay at home and take care of their children, right? This was not the case of many, many other kinds of women, working-class women, women of color. So it described a very particular segment of the population. But it was put forward as feminism. Right? This is to be liberated as a woman means to be able to go into the workplace, right? It means to be able to speak as an equal with men in professional realms as well as personal realms. It means to have your husband co-parent with you. It means, you know, all kinds of things like that. So that started off, and there were various different kinds of strains of feminism in this. So there was that, which is seen as a liberal feminism. So liberal feminism meaning that it was about equal rights and individual rights. We need individual rights in all realms of life, right?
So it was women's equality within the way things were basically operating.
Exactly, yeah. And it was challenging gender roles of what's natural for a man and what a woman to do, right? So there was liberal feminism, but there were also Marxist and socialist feminisms at that time.
And did they come later? So
they were kind of around the same
time. Okay.
Yeah, but they didn't get as much attention.
Okay.
And they were saying also, well, yes, the housewife at home is there because she helps to produce surplus value for the capitalist. So in other words, she helps to maintain her husband while the husband goes into the workplace and creates surplus value in the factory, right? Works for the factory owner, creates value for the factory owner. But who takes care of the worker? Well, it's the woman, the housewife at home, and she's not paid for that. So she's part of the larger capitalist cycle, but she doesn't get any remuneration for it. So the whole capitalist system is actually dependent on the housewife at home. So, there are those kinds of feminisms that were challenging structural inequalities and saying we need to change political economy to give liberation to women. And then there were more radical feminists, radical culturalists, who saw men and women as radically different. Some of them saw it as men and women as biologically different. So you might have had somebody like Carol Gilligan who said, that their psyches are different, that women care more. This is an ethics of care. So women care, men don't care as much. If women were in power, we wouldn't have war because they care more. And there were radical lesbian separatists who said, we need to have a society of women, all women. Men, there's no place for men in here. So that was kind of from the 60s to the 80s or so. It's liberating for some women to go into the workforce. Well, for all the other women who had to work, as domestics, as whatever else, it was liberating to get into the home, right? So there were very different sets of questions. So you had a whole movement, right, of women of color. You had the Combahee River Collective of Black women who, our First Lady in New York, Bill de Blasio's wife, Shirley McRae, was a member.
Right, a leading member.
A leading member, which is just incredible that we can have her as
First Lady.
As our First Lady. So they came along and said, hey, and Bell Hooks was amongst these, was saying...
And Audre Lorde.
And Audre Lorde, exactly. And Kimberly Crenshaw a little bit later. And there were some, there were... a lot of Sherry Moraga, Latina feminists, and so on as well. So they were saying, excuse me, you can't talk about gender. There is no such thing as woman. There are many different kinds of women. So yeah, when you talk about gender, you can't talk about it without talking about race and class. For instance, it's not that when you talk about you're a woman and you happen to be Black, it's that you cannot understand one's womanhood without understanding also one's place in kind of racial hierarchies. Those two are intimately intertwined, right? And one of the ways to think about that is people's different experiences of gender discrimination, right? Kimberly Crenshaw gives an example in her article about this, about intersectionality of immigrant women, for instance, going into a shelter for battered women and not being accepted, A, because they didn't have papers, and B, because they couldn't speak English. So right away, they didn't fit the category of woman, and they were therefore not allowed in, right? The other kind of example of it is Black women's hesitation to speak out in case it plays into forms of racism against the whole community, right?
Right.
So already Black men were stereotyped as violent, and so on. So if you spoke about domestic violence in the home, you were undermining kind of anti-racist efforts.
Right, or concerns about their husband or the impact on their immediate family and all the rest. So intersectionality is really about the way in which all of the things in your life bear down on gender and power. It's the way that, if you're a Latina woman who's an immigrant, so you are Latina, you are a woman and you're an immigrant, and the way those things work together is unique for you than it is for Betty Friedan.
For Betty Friedan, exactly. Yeah, and it's to say that there is no such thing as a woman or a man, right?
Right.
Because they're each always attached to other kinds of ways of being in the world.
Before we go on further, I wanted to talk about what's the difference between gender and sex, because we keep talking about gender. What's gender? Like, gender, is that just a natural thing? Is that the difference between men and women? What is that?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so gender and sex. Gender, I guess one would say gender describes masculinity or femininity. But that doesn't have to be attached to a certain body, to a female body or a male body. One can wear pink and be gendered more femininely.
Yeah, like flow.
Right? Exactly. There we go. Exhibit it. Yeah. So performing, I guess what we realized is that gender is not, and one of the things about feminist movement was to challenge this and say that one could be gendered in different ways, right? So one could be a masculine woman. One could be a feminine man. And this is all about how one chooses to live one's life, what one chooses to wear, how one chooses to be, how one chooses to express oneself, one's hands gestures, all kinds of things. That is a performance of gender. Okay? So one would say gender is socially constructed. It's something that we aren't born with, but that we actually create ourselves afterwards.
And we learn.
Oh, we learn. Exactly. That's the biggest thing. There's like cultural scripts. There are things that we learn. This is how you be a woman. This is how you be a man. This is a gender feminine.
Like piercing the ears of a 1-year-old girl and putting her in a dress, right? We're already doing gender performance and assigning certain things to her, regardless of what she may feel on the inside, because we don't know what that's our thing.
Exactly. Pink, blue, whatever, babies and so on. Yeah, that's very early gendering.
And then how that policing of gender lasts sort of your whole life. So girls don't do this or boys do that. And so, which is one of the ways in which, I mean, as we've sort of spoken about before, it's not necessarily natural in the way that we do it because it has to be enforced.
Exactly. It has to, and I think in our previous conversation we made a great point, which was that if it were so natural, why is it policed over and over?
Right, it wouldn't have to be.
It wouldn't have to be. It's something that we have to learn and relearn and relearn.
Right. No one has to police your sight. Or your nose, right? No one has to say, well, you can't smell sour because sour doesn't exist. Well, you know what I mean?
Yes, exactly. So this was pretty radical to think that, that gender is actually something performed and that it's created. And some feminist theorists, like Judith Butler, would say, in fact, this is where resistance can come from. This is where we can fight back because you perform gender differently than what you're told to do.
Right. You don't have to do it the way you've been told to do it.
Exactly. And that can be a political action. The difference with sex is that sex was seen to be at least...
And not intercourse.
And not, exactly, sorry. So let's say gender, sex, and sexuality. And sex meaning like the box you check on the thing, you're male or female, right? When you're you have to say what you are. Right. And it's supposed to deal with certain parts of your anatomy that you're, male or female. So for a while, that was seen as also biologically fixed. You're born, you come out, you have a vagina, you have a penis, whatever. That makes you a man or a woman. But that was also challenged when we realized that, in fact, people's bodies are not so simple, and that those dichotomy, our bodies aren't kind of either male or female. That, in fact, we can be born with all the kind of sex attributes of both, right? Or you can have multiple combinations. You can be a woman with higher levels of testosterone.
Exactly.
You can be a man with lower levels. You can have an XYY. I mean, this is a controversy that's going on right now, and who can compete in the Olympics? Are you a woman or not? Right. And they're trying to figure out what to test, and they don't know what to test. Right. What defines sex? We're not sure. So I guess that's. I mean, it can be disturbing. It takes the ground away from underneath our feet. But both of them are malleable, actually, sex and gender. And now sexuality, of course, has nothing to do necessarily with either of those. Either of those either. You can be gendered a certain way and have certain kind of sexual desires that don't kind of go with what you're supposed to have in a heteronormative way. Right.
So there are all these different combinations of identity and all of these different sort of Rubik's Cubes of things that are playing into feminism, and then all these different ways of being a feminist, right, as we've gone through. So there's a lot to play at work. So it's a little unfair, it seems to me, to have an argument about whether or not one is specifically a feminist or not, because there are so many different types of feminism, right?
Precisely, exactly. When I teach this class, I call it theories of feminisms, because there are multiple theories and there are multiple feminisms.
Maybe feminism is like gender, which is sand on a beach. Yes. That when you're standing on a beach, it seems really permanent. You know what it is. You're walking on it. It seems firm. It has an interaction with the sea. But the minute you actually grab the sand, it slips through your fingers. You don't know what it is anymore. And that's because, in part, we're chasing a thing which doesn't really exist in a firm way, right?
Exactly. It's constantly being contested.
And remade.
And that's actually a strength. That's not a weakness. I think that would be relativist about all forms of feminism, because I think that in itself
relativism means what? Oh, they're really no different. It doesn't matter what you do or what you call yourself in terms of being a feminist. As long as you're some sort of feminist, it's okay. Is that it?
No, well, actually, it's more that all feminisms are equal in some sense. It's okay whatever you are. You have your view, I have my view. Well,
understood.
Yeah, I don't agree. I think we can make judgments on which ones perhaps are more effective. But as you pointed out earlier, what is our goal? Is it simply having women in the highest echelons, white women, black women, whatever, right? Or is it overturning the whole system? And I think that's the point to ask: is what is the goal of your feminism, right? If your feminism is to is just to put women, in power and reproduce those same hierarchies, okay, good, you've done it.
Right.
If your goal as a feminist is to undo all that kind of order that would leave some people really disenfranchised and others really enfranchised, then you're not doing it well.
Said that Beyonce was a terrorist, and when you listen to the entire thing, it's more of being a terrorist, not in terms of crossing the lines to go into Syria and join ISIS, but it's much more about an image terrorist for women, it seems to me, and to terrorize the idea of what it is to be a woman, to take one of these many different possibilities that we were just talking about and then to turn it into the example, which then people find oppressive. That was the argument. But you are there, and can you just talk a little bit about how you heard it?
Yeah. So the talk was called "Are You Still a Slave? Liberating the Black Female Body." So it was about images and possibilities of liberation for Black women. And there were 4 people participating. There was, besides bell hooks, in addition to bell hooks, a total of 4. And
on that stage was represented all these different types of gender combinations that we were talking about, right?
Exactly.
And different ideas of what it is to be a woman, or whether or not that is even an appropriate designation at all. There was a lot going on.
There was a lot going on, exactly. Exactly, and so they all, not only were they speaking about it, they were embodying it.
That's right.
Yeah, so it was a powerful group of people up there. So the discussion was about, yes, what kinds of images are in the media, and Bell Hooks was saying that she didn't find any kind of liberating images in the media. They were always the kind of women who were objectified, showing their boobs and their butt, and that these were actually nothing different than what it meant to be earlier a slave, that you had to kind of serve your master in particular ways, that you had to be objectified, that you had no power of your own.
That's right.
And she said, I see it, I still see it everywhere. For instance, look at the image of Beyonce on the cover of Time in this kind of little underwear set and so on. And that is just oppressive, right? She didn't find it liberating in any way. Janet Mock challenged her by saying, well, I think Beyonce has control over what she chooses to wear and how she wants to present herself.
Right.
And Marcy Blackman said, maybe she's taking these same images and giving them back to us, in some ways challenging them with a little extra, and shoving them in our face. This is what you want to see. Well, I want to show you, but in this particular glamorous form, right? And Bell Hooks was having none of it. She just said, oh, well, if you think that's liberating you, that's fantasy. That's just fantasy. And in this kind of context, she called Beyonce a terrorist, meaning that she creates the image for all young girls. And you have to be that, or you're not attractive, you're not valuable, you have no worth, right? So she certainly didn't mean it in any sense of any other political action, but it was about what responsibility does Beyonce have as somebody who is in the media, who is one of the most famous women out there now, and the richest. And this was something that Bell Hooks really focused on, was saying we're looking at her because she's rich, and that has to be incredible. That has to be taken into account. She's Black, but she's also rich.
Right, and that would we really care about her in the same way because if she were poor, right? If she were a poor woman, it is because she has been able to accrue vast wealth with this image that we then find this fascination, and in that she then begins to be the source of emulation.
Exactly.
And one of the interesting things to me about Beyonce, just as an image, is the way in which, in some ways, she has as her style model the Barbarella model of Jane Fonda, right? Tall woman, scantily clothed, powerful, but at the same time very sexual, and very sexual in a way that is appealing to men.
Yeah.
And that's in many ways what she reinforces. And as we talked about, that can be one type of feminism, right? Maybe a more liberal feminist model where she's within and accepting a gender role is able to be very powerful within that. But that's still in no way basically challenging the basic structure or the way things are set up for most women and the way they have to experience and navigate the world.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think Bell Hooks, her motto, her phrase is that we're living in an imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy.
Right.
And her question
is a mouthful. She can come up with an acronym, right?
Yeah. It just
an IPC. I don't know what that is.
Exactly. You have to say each time it's in your face, it feels heavy, which it is, right?
Yeah.
And so her question was, how does Beyonce challenge that?
Right.
It doesn't, right? It doesn't challenge. Certainly, it doesn't challenge the capitalist part. It doesn't necessarily challenge the imperialist part either. White supremacist, not at all. It just feels like at each of those things, she can be a strong woman out there, but she's a woman in the sense that all those things require her to be.
So one of the instances is Janay Rice. How does that play out? How does feminism play out in her life and her interaction with her husband, in her interaction with the NFL?
Yeah.
This very male. You want to talk about the definition of patriarchy?
Exactly.
I mean, how does it play out in people's lives? What's the relevancy and the currency of it for someone like her?
Right. Yeah. No, that's great because, of course, these are our biggest questions that everybody is seeing. I think part of it will help us to understand what does it mean for her. Why would she stay with him and forgive him or say that, it wasn't his fault? I think it's about understanding the larger structures in which, she's a part and he's a part too.
Right.
It's not about saying, oh, he's a violent, horrible person. I mean, sure, he was violent.
But horrible.
Right, but why is that, right? What has enabled him to do that?
Right.
Why is that seen as okay? Why is it okay for her to say, this is okay for him to do to me. I somehow deserve this, right? I think there are larger structures of power that are racialized and gendered and so on. And we should all be questioning, do we say this too? Is this okay? In what, parts of our lives do we say oppression is okay? I'm not saying that it's black and white and that that she has false consciousness in some senses, and by saying she loves her husband and forgives him or whatever.
Because from her perspective, as she talked about, she was empowered. This is my decision. This is what we are doing. You are getting in the way. This constant attacking of him is actually re-victimizing me. And so the argument is about empowering me, but I feel you're taking away my power. So she's made a very strong argument about a choice.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and who are we to say that she doesn't feel empowered in those kinds of situations? On the other hand, I do think there are structural realities, and I wonder who wants to be knocked out and to be punched and to be. I mean, I just feel like those kinds of arguments just say it's okay, it's my choice, it's a relativist choice, are ones that are dangerous because they often where they end up playing the most is saying say women of color or women from different places. That's the way you want to do it. It's your culture. It's okay, which really disempowers women there and say, okay, it's okay for me to be beaten, but not for you. I think those are dangerous arguments, and I think the biggest thing to do is to think about what makes it okay for him to do it and for her to say, I've made this choice.
And how does it play out? How do you think feminism plays out, the broad concept, not the variations, but in the life of someone like Michelle Obama? Right, who herself is very much, in a lot of ways, a post-feminist figure in which she made decisions about who she was going to marry, when they were going to get married, how many children they had. For most of their career, she was the primary breadwinner. His career took the backseat to hers.
Yeah.
But then now in this role of First Lady, she has a very traditional role and a role that comes out of the position of the plantation mistress in American society. I mean, the first Lady of the United States was a plantation mistress, Martha Washington, and she set the tone for what that was going to be like, what that office was supposed to be, and Dolly Madison and all these other people.
Right. Yeah, I think such an important point is that one gets put into certain kinds of positions that are historically shaped, and it's very difficult to shake them, right? It's very difficult to completely overturn them. And I don't think Michelle Obama has, right? She hasn't been, she's certainly challenged it in the way she can, right?
But every time she challenges it, there is a tremendous backlash, right?
Exactly. So she goes a little, you know, so far. She shows her arms. You know, she shows what she can do. She shows how strong and smart she is, but only within the confines of the wife.
Right. Because every time she does too much, you know, like trying to get people to eat healthy, it then becomes, you know, a condition for the Republic to be concerned about. And that may actually, it tipped off something in my head about Janay Rice. I mean, one of the things is that she's trapped in a very traditional institution, you know, that for the longest time was about property, right? And the sharing of property and the pooling of property and resources. And that's pretty much still what is her relationship, right? And so she is trapped in this very traditional institution in which women made trade-offs in the way that it was set up, which may in part explain what's going on for her.
Absolutely, and that's why I think kind of an analysis that really does take into account all these things, race and class and all those kinds of things, it is absolutely essential. Like, one reason she's also not going to speak out is, again, the image of Black man as incredibly violent, right? She's not going to reproduce that. Why would she reproduce that?
Right.
And as you said, at the same time she challenges it, she challenges her position in a very kind of, you know, a certain class status that's enviable, right?
Right.
So it's complicated for her to I think there's not a lot of place for her to challenge it. Let's put it that way.
Right. I mean, this goes back to what Belle was arguing about. Belle Hooks, I shouldn't call her Belle, I don't know her. but was arguing about Beyonce, right? In which she's in some respects playing a very traditional role. She doesn't really challenge it, and has gained a lot of power off of it because she's able to squeeze in it and make it work for her.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess, again, Bell Hooks calling it faux feminism, right? Which is reproducing the order that already oppresses you. I think about in the New Yorker article by Michelle Goldberg, which was showing radical feminists versus trans and trans activists. Is
that the center of a new argument in feminism between those who identify as feminists who embrace trans rights and women and men, and those who don't? Right? Is that an important new fault line, or?
Yeah, I don't think it's an important new fault line. I think it's actually really exaggerated by the article. I think the article gave a lot more, gave way too much credit to those radical feminists, including Sheila Jeffreys, because people like to think of feminism as that.
Right.
And those people were, you know, they're not sex positive, in other words, being positive about women's or anybody's sexuality. Right? They're against sex work, against pornography, assuming that these are automatically forms of exploitation.
And this is a small number of the broad spectrum of feminism and feminists that we're talking about.
Exactly. So, you know, it might be that they're against and don't accept trans women as women, but I think the majority of other feminists do. And in fact, trans women and trans men use feminism as a theory and a strategy for liberation as well, right? So I think on the most part, people work together.
Right. And they're reinforcing, they're mutually reinforcing.
Yeah, there's struggles for social justice that deal with all kinds of discrimination.
Right.
In some ways they echo, the trans movement is about gender politics, right? Earlier, kind of more of a split came between people who are fighting against sexual oppression and gender oppression, and those are not exactly the same. But I think in this case, the trans movement and kind of the feminist movement there's no reason that they shouldn't draw on each other.
The argument between those feminists who believe and fight for trans rights and those who don't is not a new fault line in feminism. What is the new fault line in feminism? What's the future of feminism in terms of, are we in a new wave? What's the argument now amongst feminists? Is it really this collision with the idea of the economic structures playing a really big role in the way that women are able to lead their lives, such as the jobs they can have and the fight over the minimum wage, which mostly impacts disproportionately women and women of color in these low-wage jobs?
Yeah, I think that's where the strength of feminism lies. And again, I think this is supported transnationally. It's supported by kind of women's and movements around the world, which is fighting for structural forms of equality, right? Again, things that are against class divisions and the fact that the global north and the global south are increasingly seeing divisions in wealth and access to resources and so on. That's a feminist fight, and I think that's the kind of the biggest one. What we see most, I think, in the global north or maybe in the U.S. is
U.S. and Europe and
exactly Australia, where is a kind of a focus often on women's rights, and I find that as much as I think it's important to think about kind of sexual violence in conflict and so on, these have been now put into international law. In fact, gender-based violence has been seen as a crime against humanity. This was legislated by actually Catherine McKinnon in the case of Bosnia and Rwanda. So those are big gains on the one hand, but on the other hand, by focusing on those kinds of things, it actually focuses again on individual rights, right? And doesn't look at the larger inequalities that make some women subject to violence and other women not.
Right.
So on one hand, I think what we see in the media all the time is women's rights, women's rights, women's rights, and that's something like Sheryl Sandberg takes up women's rights. We have to
lean in. That had Facebook, which is women, you have all the rights that you need now. You just go out there and tackle the world, and kind of acts like a man. Sort of like Steve Harvey argument, right? Just acts like a man, and you're good to go. It's a wrap.
Exactly. We've achieved equality.
Right. It's done.
It's done. Whereas I think the more, as you were saying, revolutionary types of feminism actually challenge the larger imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchies, which include challenging the ways in which some women can't get jobs, some women can't, and not just women again. I think it's the ways in which some kinds of people don't get jobs, some kinds of people get discriminated, some kinds of people are more subject to violence than others.
Right.
Alliances are uncomfortable and not clear. It's not that you can align with women. What does that mean exactly? Right. Because again, something Bell Hooks says that white women largely align with white men. Right. So where is the movement going to be? And I think it's fraught. Who knows? Well, it's to be fought out. But I think a lot of people are coming together in different alliances that are temporary. They don't say this is what we are and this is the way it is. It's like we need to fight this fight and then we'll fight that fight. Right.
And we may not fight it with the same people.
Exactly.
We believe the same about gay marriage, that marriage, gay marriage as well, imports a lot of the structures and strictures into it.
I do. I do. And, again, I'm not against gay marriage in the sense that the ways in which people get rights is through marriage, right? And I think everybody should have equal rights. You should be able to kind of have, go see your loved one in the hospital. Right. There's many, many things. So I think that's incredibly important. I just wish all our rights weren't attached to marriage, full stop, right? So what if I live with my sister, right? Why can't I have rights in that sense, right? I think many different forms of relationality, many forms of kinship should be recognized. That's right. Aside from that particular unit. One of the strengths for me about feminist thought, I guess would say, is that it's also a way of knowing the world. So it's not just a kind of a struggle, but it's literally seeing the way you said, that things are actually not as firm as we might have thought, right? And that to understand how to engage in the world, we have to understand the way the world has been represented. Right. And a lot of that has been, for instance, if you think about forms of science, like the egg and the sperm being represented, as we spoke about before, the sperm being represented as active and the egg being represented as passive. So our cultural ideas of what gender is being put onto forms of science and what we understand as objective. And feminists have challenged that and shown us that to know the world in a particular way is also to be able to act in the world in a particular way. I think that's incredibly valuable. Feminism is not just about kind of feminine gendered bodies. It's just not. It can't be. It's about a social justice for all of us. I mean, the forms of masculinity that are imposed on boys are incredibly oppressive, right? So feminism should, I mean, as you're saying, you can choose now to come in and out and embrace the parts of masculinity that you want and the parts of femininity that you want. But I think that the counterpart to that particular Betty Friedan femininity and masculinity is oppressive to both kind of men and women.
That's right. And the minute that women get to say, I'm no longer subservient, and I don't have to be subservient to you legally, socially, economically, or sexually, it then challenges all types of subservience that are then enforced.
Exactly.
Which is what's been really important about it, and continues to be really important about it.
Yeah.
You know, and so that explains why if someone who you would be, I mean, in some respects, the Beyonce argument for bell hooks is the exact opposite. But the parallel one of you and your mother, right? Like she feels that Beyonce is the one, to a certain degree, who's coming and imposing a specific idea of gender on her and on girls and women that she interacts with, and that's oppressive.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And that's what, and maybe perhaps that ultimately is the entire point, is that we stop having to have one particular way of domination, of image, of being, and the way in which we in our day-to-day lives enforce that.
Absolutely.
How has feminism changed your life?
How has feminism changed?
Like, how has what you studied changed you think?
Yeah. In profound ways. I feel like I'm constantly struggling with how to be in the world, right? I think, again, like you, I think we're trying to find ways to be outside these stereotypes, and yet constantly fall into them, you know, because they're
falling in and out of them,
falling
all
in and
the
out of
time.
them.
Yeah,
right. And one thing, you know, I have chosen not to have children, which immediately has you're not seen as a real woman. If you know what's wrong with you, you're not really caring. You don't want to have children. It's amazing how that still persists. You know, there are a number of ways that I'm not for marriage in any form unless one needs it to get documents or to get health care or things like that, because I think it's a structure that reproduces forms of discrimination and inequality. It was initially a relationship, as you said, about property, right? It's the husband, and who owns the wife. In some sense, she's a form of property for him. And anybody who's gotten divorced realizes it is about property ultimately. And this goes for gay marriage as well. So these are the ways in which I'm constantly trying to kind of go against these things, but yet, I get gendered, and I gender myself in ways that are also seen as feminine, right? So it's a constant struggle.
Right, that you make these really non-traditional, in some respects very radical, right, in the history of women, choices that women even didn't get to make, right? The ability to decide that you're not going to have children is a decision that many women around the world, hundreds of millions, don't get to choose.
Right.
It's not a choice that they get to have.
Precisely, and it's a very positioned choice. When I think of my mother, when I was growing up, my mother grew up in India, was born in India, and she was actually an orphan there, and from a very difficult childhood. It's a long kind of story, but when she got to Canada and she married my father, who was actually from South Africa and fleeing his own, their own struggles there, she chose to stay at home and be a housewife, and that was an empowering choice. And she used to say to me, "I hate feminists," because she felt oppressed by it. They're telling her, "You're staying at home, you're oppressed," But it's all these intersections of race and gender and class. She was, like many women of color, she didn't, for her, it was a really empowering thing to get to stay at home and not have to go out and work. So again, my choice is it's very located, of course, in my own forms of privilege, right? That I can work. I've chosen to work to make my career something that's important to me. But that's a very privileged way of living as well.
So for me, the biggest addition to feminism to my life, I think, would be around gender, right, and around gender roles, and the ability to be able to, as I describe it, I come in and out of different genders all the time, which without feminism really wouldn't have been possible, and without that essential challenge and butting up against the idea that there were certain ways that we had to be, that we would still have to make these very limiting choices, which, just pick any film from the 1950s, right? In so many ways, people found that system really oppressive in a variety of different ways. I mean, Jimmy Dean, like all his movies are about, right? That weight of this thing that we have to be, and The Rebel Without a Cause was sort of the teenage male companion to the thing that couldn't be named by Betty Friedan.
Right,
this weight that was just bearing down on people. And without that having been rolled out of the way, there's no way that I would be able to be fully who I am. So
yeah, and so I think, I mean, absolutely. And I think you bring up a hugely important point, which is that it's about masculinities and femininities. Again, it's about all kinds of bodies. And feminism is not just about kind of feminine gendered bodies. It's just not. It can't be. It's about a social justice for all of us. I mean, the forms of masculinity that are imposed on boys are incredibly oppressive, right? So feminism should, I mean, as you're saying, you can choose now to come in and out and embrace the parts of masculinity that you want and the parts of femininity that you want. But I think that the counterpart to that particular Betty Friedan femininity and masculinity is oppressive to both kinds of men and women.
Thank you so much for joining. It was really a fantastic, wide-ranging conversation.
Yes, thank you so much.
And I loved it. Thank you so much.